Some disappearances do not belong only to a family or a city, they end up belonging to the very silence of an era. Among the yellowed records of the early 20th century, there is one case that always reappears when talking about travelers, makeshift shelters, and mountain roads. The episode known as the disappearance of the 50 pilgrims from the Pinecrest twins' mountain barn in 1902. Those who open these old files find at first only numbers and dates. But as the pages turn, two names are repeated insistently: Elias Pinecrest and Margaret Pinecrest, fraternal twins born in 1882, children of small rural landowners who lived on a strip of high ground, between narrow valleys and pine-covered slopes in a ridge region between eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. In records from that time, the property is described as a ridge farm, and the large wooden barn that provided shelter and stored their harvest appears in almost all subsequent accounts. The setting at the turn of the century was that of a slowly changing interior. The first railroad lines had already crossed some valleys. The mail arrived more regularly, but community life still revolved around church services, fairs, and the planting and harvesting seasons. The wind that blew across the Pinecrest Heights carried with it the smell of resin, damp earth, and smoke from chimneys, and at night the sky was described as a dark cloth where the stars seemed closer than anywhere else. The twins' parents, Thomas and Abigail Pinecrest, appear in the census as medium-scale farmers. They owned a few head of cattle, a small orchard, a robust vegetable garden, and above all, a barn large enough to house not only tools and grain, but also people. In testimonies collected decades later, neighbors described that barn as a wooden shelter erected against the wind from the ridge, a place where, on stormy nights, travelers could find little more than a plank floor, dry straw, and a corner to rest their legs tired from long walks. This is where the twins come into the picture. Elias, according to baptism records and church attendance lists, was considered the quieter of the two, responsible for the accounts, measuring the harvest, and dealing with merchants passing through on the roads. Margaret, on the other hand, appeared in letters and notes as the voice of Pinecrest. She spoke to strangers, welcomed pilgrims, organized impromptu meals, and apparently it was she who insisted that the barn be adapted to accommodate groups in transit. In the notes of an itinerant pastor written in hurried handwriting, there is a phrase that is repeated in more than one report. The Pinecrest twins welcome pilgrims as if they were long-lost relatives. This seemingly simple comment shows how the family was perceived, a Christian home that never closed its doors, a kind of anchor between towns, churches, and small settlements along the mountain range. The climate of the region, according to travelers' diaries, was harsh and unpredictable. Spring brought flash floods. Summer was characterized by sweltering heat in the valleys and cold winds in the highlands. Autumn arrived with thick fog, and winter, though not always severe, could surprise with late frosts. Perhaps that is why the Pinecrest barn gradually became more than just a hay storage facility. In oral accounts collected in the 1940s, former residents recall nights of singing, praying, and storytelling under the dark wooden ceiling. Surviving documents indicate that around 1900, the region received an influx of pilgrims, groups of faithful who traveled from town to town, participating in religious gatherings, revival campaigns, and country meetings that lasted for days. Local church records mention processions of believers climbing the ridge and night vigils high in the valley. The Pinecrest barn, strategically located near a bend in the ridge road, became known as a safe place to spend the night. It is here that the case begins to take shape as something more than just routine hospitality. Among the documents stored in the old town hall, many of them rescued after a partial fire in the 1920s, is a notebook attributed to Elias Pinecrest. This is not a personal diary but a dry, almost accounting-like record of comings and goings. It lists sacks of corn, barrels of water, bales of hay, and on some pages a curious column, seats occupied. On almost every date, the number is modest, 3, 7, 12. At times of greater religious activity, the records rise to 20, 25. And then, on a page marked with the year 1902, Elias's firm handwriting records for the only time, a number that does not appear again in any other entry. 50 seats. The official records do not explain why in that year so many pilgrims climbed the ridge to the barn. There is no clear mention of a large regional gathering or a calamity that would have necessitated this movement. What we do find are fragments. An incomplete letter from a pastor in a neighboring county that mentions a caravan of believers going up to Pinecrest. A note from a merchant mentioning unusual movement of people on the roads, and a marginal note in a local grocery store ledger describing purchases for a large group in a hurry to reach the ridge before nightfall. As for the twins, the few direct accounts of their appearance and behavior date from before and after 1902, never from the exact period of the event. Older witnesses, interviewed at the end of their lives, describe Elias as a young man with narrow shoulders, an attentive gaze, and hands always busy with some tool or piece of paper. Margaret, on the other hand, is remembered as a firm presence, with a low voice and a gaze that witnesses describe as too direct for someone who lived so far from the world. Together they were seen as an inseparable couple, as if the barn were both a shared enterprise and a silent secret between the two. The surrounding community, consisting of a few scattered farms and a small wooden church in a nearby valley, viewed the Pinecrests with a mixture of respect and distance. There are no records of scandals, fights, or public disputes. On the contrary, the few documents that remain speak of loans paid on time, regular attendance at church services, and help with other people's harvests. Even so, one expression appears in more than one testimony collected many years later. They kept things to themselves. It was as if, behind the hospitality of the barn, there was a core of silence that no one could completely penetrate. What is officially known is that in the fall of 1902, 50 pilgrims, men, women, perhaps some children, traveled along mountain trails and roads to the Pinecrest twins' barn. This information does not come from a single source, but from the overlap of several clues. Church attendance lists where some names appear for the last time, lodging records in previous towns, notes of purchases of bread, salt and flour at grocery stores along the way. Everything points to the barn on the ridge as the final destination of that journey. However, as the documents approach the exact date, the silence begins to grow. There are no reports of arrival or departure. There is no description of songs on that specific night, nor of special prayers. Instead, what we find is an interval, an absence of words where, logically, there should be at least a few lines. It is precisely in this void that a strange detail stands out, almost hidden by dust and the passage of time. On the last page of Elijah's notebook, where it reads 50 seats, another type of writing appears in the lower margin in lighter ink, as if it had been added years later by another hand. It is a single sentence, short, undated, unsigned, almost lost among moisture stains and fingerprints. The next morning, all the seats were empty, and it is from this sentence, written in the margin of a mundane record, that the mystery of the 50 Pinecrest pilgrims truly begins to exist for history. Before the disappearance enveloped the ridge in silence, documents indicate that the daily life of the Pinecrest family followed a simple rhythm, guided by the wind, work, and small routines that were repeated with almost ritualistic precision. The barn, which would later be remembered as the scene of one of the most intriguing cases in the region, was then just a stopping point for travelers and pilgrims going up and down the winding roads. Elias and Margaret, although twins, seemed to occupy complementary places within the dynamics of the farm. Early in the morning, when the sun had not yet touched the treetops, Margaret tended to the chickens, drew water from the well, and checked the supplies. Elias, for his part, walked to the barn before the rest of the house had even awakened. He would inspect the wood, check the strength of the beams, verify the straw reserves, and open the wide doors, letting the high-altitude wind renew the air. The few accounts that mention visits to the barn before 1902 describe a quiet routine, travelers leaving coins on a makeshift box, Margaret offering hot water or a piece of bread, Elias discreetly noting how many slept there. There was no glamour, no special attraction. It was just a safe, simple, quiet, and useful refuge. The Pinecrest family was not wealthy, but neither were they among the poorest on the hillsides. They had enough to get by through hard work and mutual dependence. The father, Thomas, suffered from chronic back pain, probably as a result of many winters carrying firewood and heavy tools. The mother, Abigail, sewed for the neighboring houses and had a habit of lighting a lamp in the kitchen window whenever someone was staying in the barn, as a way of indicating that the house was awake in case any travelers needed help. The relationship between the twins is described as a silent complicity. There is no record of fights or serious disagreements. In later testimonies, the community remembers them as two young men who seem to talk with their eyes, an expression common in stories of close-knit siblings, but which, in the context of this case, took on an additional nuance of mystery. At that time, the region was experiencing a kind of discreet religious fervor. Small churches were multiplying in the valleys and mountains, itinerant pastors frequently crossed the roads, and field meetings brought entire families together for days or weeks. The pilgrimage movement was not uncommon. Groups of 10, 15, or 20 faithful traveled on foot, carrying blankets, lamps, and small rations of food, and stopped at farms like the Pinecrests when night fell before reaching their final destination. It is precisely in this continuous flow of travelers that the first indications that something was amiss in that particular year emerge from the testimonies. People who passed through the barn months before the disappearance recall that Margaret seemed more attentive than usual, as if she were expecting someone. She asked insistently about larger groups coming from the valley region or the northern mountains. Her curiosity was always described as friendly but persistent. The accounts also mention a subtle change in Elias's behavior. He, who had always kept precise records, began to stockpile more supplies than necessary. He bought extra bales of straw, reinforced the barn floor, and, according to a local merchant, ordered more lanterns than any traveler could justify. There is no record of him explaining why. The notebook suggests that, around August 1902, the number of pilgrims staying there began to grow, not dramatically, but frequently. Smaller groups passed over the ridge at short intervals, as if preparing the ground for something larger. A letter written by a pastor from a neighboring county, preserved only in part with burnt edges, mentions a gathering of faith that will climb the ridge before the first frost. This vague and incomplete phrase is one of the few indications of prior organization. And although it does not directly mention the barn, it is difficult to ignore the temporal coincidence between these accounts and the notation of the 50 seats. There are also testimonies describing an unusual night a few weeks before the disappearance. A neighbor who lived half a mile from the farm recounted decades later that he heard voices coming from the barn, not from a fight or a party, but from a low, constant conversation, as if many people were gathered there. He couldn't explain why it disturbed him. After all, travelers were common. But there are times when the tone of voices, though indistinct, holds something difficult to name. Another recurring point in the accounts is Margaret's insistence on keeping the barn ready, regardless of the movement. She changed the straw every day, organized the blankets, checked the buckets and water barrels. Some women in the community said she seemed to be expecting a visit more important than any the Crest had ever seen. The twins' routine, therefore, was charged with a silent expectation, something that does not appear directly in the documents but is hinted at between the lines in the testimonies. It was as if they knew, weeks in advance, that this fall would bring an unusual influx of people. Whether that perception came from warnings, religious rumors, or simply intuition is unknown. However, there is one detail that weighs heavily in the accounts and that would be essential for later researchers. None of the people who mentioned seeing the twins in late September or early October 1902 could describe them in the same way. Some claim that Elias seemed tired and distracted. Others say they saw him more animated than usual, talking about repairs to the barn. As for Margaret, there are conflicting descriptions of her mood, her posture, and even her presence on the farm in the last days before the arrival of the 50 pilgrims. This inconsistency, common in late memories, makes it impossible to completely reconstruct the emotional state of both. But it reveals something important. The last weeks before the disappearance do not fit perfectly into the community's accounts, as if each witness had seen only part of the story. And it is in this tangle of signs, silent expectations, and incomplete records that the case begins to take shape. Because although nothing extraordinary happened in full view of everyone, there was an undercurrent that moved the days at Pinecrest Farm, a shared premonition, even though no one was aware of it at the time. Everything continued on its seemingly normal course until the night when the travelers began to climb the ridge road toward the barn. A night that, in the records that have survived, always ends abruptly. The last confirmed reports before the disappearance begin on the afternoon of October 11th, 1902, when sunlight fell obliquely on the ridge, gilding the tops of the pines and casting long shadows on the dirt road. According to preserved records from the neighboring county, several pilgrims had been seen walking north that same day. Men and women carrying rolled-up blankets, small bags of food, and lamps protected by frosted glass. The reconstruction most accepted by researchers suggests that, around 4 in the afternoon, the first group of about 10 people passed by the small church in the valley. An elderly woman, interviewed almost 50 years later, claimed to remember a soft song rising up the road, as if the group were marking their steps with a discreet melody, the kind used to keep pace on long walks. An eyewitness, whose letter has been partially preserved, mentioned that the pilgrims were calm, unhurried, but determined to reach the barn before nightfall. At the same time, there are rumors, never officially confirmed, that Margaret was seen at the foot of the ridge road, watching the travelers' progress. A neighbor, who lived almost a kilometer away, said she saw a female figure holding the hem of her skirt against the wind, staring intently to the south. Another person claimed to have seen a male silhouette near the orchard fence, as if waiting for something. These testimonies, although contradictory, reinforce the idea that the twins were watching for the group's arrival. Whether out of anticipation, responsibility, or something not stated in the records, no one knows. As the minutes tick by in the accounts, the scene becomes increasingly cinematic. The sun setting, the wind cooling, the air taking on the smell of burning wood coming from the houses scattered throughout the valleys. The narrow, uneven ridge road seemed to lead all footsteps to a single point, the Pinecrest barn. At around 5:30 p.m., according to estimates based on shadows and descriptions of the light, the second group of pilgrims would have appeared at the bend in the road. A merchant returning from the city said he had passed a quiet line of weary faces, some holding the lanterns they would later light. He did not follow them to the barn, but he said the direction was obvious. That climb led to only one place before dark, the twins' large building. The third and final group would have passed through the region near dusk. Accounts speak of a reddish twilight, of mists gathering at the base of the pine trees, and of an unusual silence for that hour, as if even the insects had suspended their buzzing before nightfall. Those were, most likely, the last moments the 50 pilgrims were seen by outside witnesses. From this point on, the records become fragmented and silent, allowing only for a careful reconstruction of the night in the barn. It was the Pinecrest's custom to light 2 oil lamps at the barn's front door when they were expecting travelers. In a note preserved in a testimony, a neighbor claimed to have seen 2 lights swaying faintly in the wind on that particular night. This indicates that the twins were alive, conscious, and awaiting the arrival of the pilgrims. The interior of the barn is described in later documents as a spacious room with reinforced plank flooring and the smell of dry wood. The architecture was simple. 2 rows of pillars supported the roof, leaving a central aisle and, on either side, hay arranged in layers. There is also mention of makeshift benches, boards placed on crates and smooth logs, which would be the seats noted by Elijah. According to the best chronological hypothesis, the first group arrived while there was still enough light to organize their belongings. The second group would have arrived shortly after, settling in quietly. The third would have arrived at the barn already under the dim light of the lamps. There are no reports of disturbances, fights, or any other noteworthy events that night. What does exist in later accounts is the memory of a strong wind blowing against the hillside, causing the boards to creak and the frames to shake, a detail that is often overlooked, but which is present in two testimonies collected 30 years later, speaks of a dull sound, something like a prolonged noise that came from the ridge shortly after nightfall. Witnesses never described it as a scream, nor as a song. It was a sound that came from nowhere, in the words of a resident who could no longer see well at the time of the testimony. At 9 o'clock at night, according to estimates based on the brightness of the moon and wind patterns recorded in the region's weather journals, the temperature dropped sharply. This would have led the Pilgrims to huddle together, trying to keep warm. The barn, although closed, had cracks through which the wind could pass. The floor creaked under the combined weight of 50 people, and it is precisely here that the historical narrative finds its darkest point, the last confirmed evidence. A few days after the disappearance, when authorities and neighbors entered the barn, they found clear signs of recent occupation. Crushed straw, lamps burned down to the end, overlapping footprints on the floor. There were also spread out blankets, used wooden bowls, and the remains of simple meals. However, according to the report kept by the county, there was something else. In all the places where people should have been, there were only empty seats, lined up as if they had been left in order, but with no sign of a collective departure. No valuables were found. No suitcases, no extra pairs of shoes, even personal items which travelers never left behind had disappeared along with them. The last confirmed piece of evidence is a set of footprints leading to the back door of the barn, a door that was rarely used and opened onto a steep slope covered with dense undergrowth. The footprints start out clear and deep, but disappear abruptly after a few meters, as if the trail had been erased by wind or loose soil. This interruption, recorded by 2 county deputies, is the exact moment when the story enters the realm of the inexplicable, not the supernatural, but the void left by the total absence of witnesses, sounds, or traces. The report ends with a note written in faded ink. It seemed as if they had all gotten up at the same time, and were simply no longer to be seen. And it is this sentence, as much as Elijah's note about the 50 seats, that marks the beginning of the formal investigations and the point of greatest tension in the entire case. On the morning the disappearance was discovered, the entire valley woke up earlier than usual. The bell of the small church rang outside its usual schedule, which in itself would have been enough to unsettle the community. But what really spread the rumor was the arrival of a neighbor at the rectory, panting, unable to speak. When he finally managed to, he only muttered, "The barn is empty. All the seats, all of them." 2 men mounted their horses and rode up the narrow road leading to Pinecrest farm. According to one of their later accounts, the scene they encountered upon arrival did not seem like a place of tragedy, but of sudden abandonment. The barn doors were ajar, swaying in the wind. The interior lamp had burned itself out, leaving only a wisp of dry smoke in the air. The overall impression was that of a night lived intensely, but suddenly interrupted. When county authorities arrived, accompanied by curious neighbors, an initial effort was made to listen to witnesses, analyze footprints, and understand the state of the place. But what emerged from the first days of investigation was a confusing mosaic of noises, frustrated expectations, and contradictory memories. There were no signs of a struggle. No objects had been left behind. There were no clear traces of departure. The silence weighed tangibly. Even decades later, some residents said that mornings seemed quieter than normal, as if the wind had calmed. The community reacts families in the neighboring valleys were accustomed to dealing with misfortunes, floods, diseases, off-season storms. But the disappearance of 50 people in a single night, ordinary people, pilgrims mostly humble, created a sense of helplessness that no previous record mentions. The women prepared meals and brought them to Pinecrest, as if food could fill the void left by the travelers' absence. The men organized searches of the ravines, hilltops, and side trails. The local pastor led long prayers in which he mentioned the need to find answers in what we cannot yet see. However, the more they searched, the more questions arose. Ambiguous testimonies. Residents who had seen the Pilgrims climbing the ridge that afternoon were interviewed repeatedly, and in each account, details emerged that seemed to contradict each other, as if memory had been affected by the strangeness of the case. One witness claimed to have seen 50 people walking in 3 separate groups. Another said that the last group was larger than the others. Another mentioned a lamp held by a fair-haired woman, something impossible to verify, as no complete nominal record of the Pilgrims was found. One man who lived almost a kilometer from the barn insisted that he had heard a dull thud that night. Another said he had seen a light moving among the pine trees, as if someone were walking with a lamp. Both recounted this years later, when accuracy was already uncertain. But the most enigmatic testimony came from a woman who, when interviewed in the 1940s, said she remembered Margaret Pinecrest the afternoon before her disappearance, walking alone near the cornfield, with a blanket in her hands. The witness said she tried to greet her, but Margaret seemed distant, as if she were listening to something the other person couldn't hear. There is no confirmation of this account, and subsequent investigators treat it with caution. Even so, its persistence in subsequent interviews always attracted attention. The material clues investigators found little physical evidence, but all of it sparked debates that continue to this day. 1. The footprints at the back door. They were clear and deep, indicating that several people had passed through. But they disappeared abruptly after a few feet, as if the soft ground had been disturbed by the night wind. It is not known whether this was caused by natural reasons or human interference. 2. The burned-out lamps. The condition of the lamps indicates that they remained lit for several hours, suggesting that the Pilgrims were awake or restless for part of the night. The absence of sound reports contradicts this, but it is possible that they were all silent for reasons we can only speculate about today. 3. The aligned benches. The most remarkable thing was that the seats were meticulously organized, as if 50 people had gotten up at the same time, and no benches had been dragged or overturned. This detail appears in 3 different reports, written by people who did not know each other. What happened to the Pinecrests? The fate of Elias and Margaret became a second layer of mystery. Records differ as to their exact location in the hours after the disappearance. An initial report states that the twins were at their parents' house when the search began, in a state of deep shock. Another document, found decades later, says that when the first neighbors arrived, the house was empty, and it is unknown when the twins returned. This discrepancy was never resolved. There is also the testimony of a young man at the time, who later became a farmer, who claimed to have seen Elias walking alone on the ridge road before dawn. He described the young man as pale, staring ahead, as if he saw nothing. There is no confirmation of this account, but its existence contributed to theories, all fragile, all incomplete. The human and plausible revelation. Decades later, investigators came to the only possible conclusion in light of what was not found. The disappearance was not the result of explicit violence or obvious outside intervention. Everything points to a collective departure, organized or at least without resistance. What does this mean? It means that, at some point that night, 50 people made a joint decision or followed a leader who left no trace. It means that the Pinecrest twins, whether by choice or circumstance, participated not only as hosts, but as direct witnesses to the group's last movement. And it means, finally, that the most disturbing revelation in the documents is also the simplest. No one was taken. They left. Where did they go? Why? With whom? These are questions that the files do not answer and may never answer. The final cliffhanger of the block. But there is one document that changes the course of interpretations. A letter found behind the floor of the Pinecrest house, written in Elias's handwriting, and dated a few days after the disappearance. The letter begins vaguely, but ends with a sentence that, on its own, changed the tone of all subsequent studies. It wasn't us who took them to the ridge that night. They already knew where they were going. When investigators return to old cases, they are not only looking for answers, but for the presence of something that stands the test of time. And when reviewing the disappearance of the 50 Pinecrest pilgrims more than a century later, what is found is not a conclusion, but an echo, a sound that cannot be heard, but that remains between the cracks of what was never said. The documents stored in rural archives, the letters recovered from the bottom of trunks, the testimonies collected with trembling voices only make up a framework. What happened within it remains inclined towards silence. The barn, rebuilt twice over the decades, no longer bears any trace of what it saw that night. New wood replaced the original beams, and the old boards, stored for years in a family outbuilding, were sold and disappeared from view, like everything else related to that story. Elias and Margaret also became almost ghostly figures in the pages of the archives, not in the supernatural sense, but in that of documented absence. After the disappearance, both remained in the region for some time, but little is known about their later lives. There are no records of marriages or moves to nearby cities. In a census from later years, the name Pinecrest appears crossed out in dark ink without explanation. The twins' silence was perhaps the last layer of protection over something they could not express. Or perhaps it was just their way of continuing to live in a place where 50 people had crossed the night and were never seen again. In situations like this, the community finds no words, and the family that remains finds no way to be understood. The case continued to be debated for decades, not because of any spectacular elements, which do not exist, but because of the profound humanity contained in what was not recorded. In a region accustomed to slow routines, the predictability of the seasons, and the transparency of community relationships, the collective disappearance represented an almost physical rupture in the fabric of rural life. Some scholars claim that the Pilgrims were following a spiritual orientation that was never fully understood. Others believe they may have been led by someone outside Pinecrest, someone who went unnoticed on the ridge trails. Still others argue that they all simply left together, not out of flight or desperation, but of their own accord. The letter found years later, written by Elias and hidden under the floor, remains the most disturbing clue. Its final fragment, "They already knew where they were going," does not clarify anything, but neither does it allow the story to be easily closed. This phrase, so brief and so loaded with meaning, suggests that the Pilgrims knew their destination, even if they never recorded it in writing. And this is perhaps the most difficult thing to accept for those seeking explanations. There are human decisions that leave no visible traces because they belong only to the moment in which they were made. When reviewing the records of the ridge, the modern researcher realizes that no theory survives intact when confronted with silence. Every hypothesis collides with the simple and inescapable reality that 50 people all together disappeared in an organized manner, without noise, without haste, without leaving a trace. It is not the extraordinary that is astonishing about this case, but the ordinary transformed into emptiness. Former residents said that, for many years, it was possible to feel a change in the atmosphere when passing through the barn area. It was not fear or superstition, just the feeling that something had been interrupted there, like a half-abandoned conversation or a step that begins firmly and ends in nothingness. Today, visitors to the area find only peaceful hills, trees swaying in the wind, and land where a few animals graze. Nothing betrays the fact that this spot in the landscape was once the final destination of 50 travelers. Nothing suggests that a collective journey that we still do not understand ended there. And perhaps that is the final reflection of this reconstructed archive. Not all stories seek to be resolved. Some just ask to be remembered. And by being remembered, they continue to exist, even if their mystery remains intact. The disappearance of the Pinecrest Pilgrims does not dissipate with time. On the contrary, it intensifies the silence of those who try to understand it. Every reading, every investigation, every attempt to connect dots that were not meant to fit reinforces the same inevitable conclusion, that their absence is as concrete as their presence would have been. In the end, all that remains is the image of 50 empty seats under a wooden ceiling, lined up in perfect order, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. And that image alone is enough to silence any investigator.